It happened on a Tuesday morning in October, in one of those private banking rooms in downtown Boston, where the chairs cost more than most people's cars, and the silence feels expensive. The kind of silence that wraps around you like cashmere. I remember the weight of my Hermes bag against my thigh, the way the autumn light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charles River, turning everything golden and unreal. I remember thinking how strange it was that money changes the texture of a room. The air itself feels different when you have 8 figures in your account. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Like this video so this story reaches more hearts, and subscribe for the next journeys. The manager, Patricia, mid-50s, elegant in that understated way that comes from actual wealth rather than aspiration, had just finished explaining my new portfolio structure. Everything was immaculate. Everything was perfect. And then she did something I'll never forget. She leaned forward, lowered her voice, and said words that made my blood run cold. Words that explained everything I'd been refusing to see about my marriage, my life, the past 15 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Eleanor Ashford, though I kept my maiden name, which should have told me something right there. I'm 41 now. I made my fortune in biotech, specifically in women's health innovations, that nobody wanted to fund until I made them fund it. The kind of work that makes you ruthless and tender at the same time. The kind of success that arrives with champagne, and also with questions you're not ready to answer. The brownstone where I lived then, where I still live, sits in Beacon Hill, all brick and history and windows that look out onto gas lamps that still burn at dusk. Federal style, 1820s, the kind of house that makes visitors whisper. I'd bought it outright the month after my company went public. Walked through it alone, my footsteps echoing on the original hardwood, and thought, this is what winning looks like. But winning, I was learning, doesn't feel the way you imagine it will. That morning at the bank, I'd been married to James for 14 years. James Ashford, the name that opened doors before I even had money of my own. Old Boston family. Yale. Corporate law. The kind of handsome that photographs well at charity galas. We'd met when I was 25, scrambling to fund my first clinical trials, and he was 32. Already a partner, already everything I thought I wanted to become. He made me feel safe. That's what I would have told you. That's what I told myself. Patricia handed me a leather folder embossed with the bank's crest, and as I reached for it, something flickered across her face. Not quite pity, not quite warning. Something older, something women have been passing between each other in glances for centuries. Eleanor, she said quietly, there's something I need to tell you. Something they don't cover in the standard wealth management orientation. My hand froze halfway to the folder. It's about patterns we see, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, though we were completely alone. Patterns with women who come into significant wealth after marriage. Patterns that show up in the financial behavior of their... She stopped, looked at the closed door, looked back at me, and then she told me what she'd noticed, what the bank's systems had flagged, what she was ethically obligated to mention, woman to woman, even though it technically wasn't her place. I felt the room tilt, felt every expensive surface, the marble, the leather, the mahogany, press in closer. Because what Patricia was describing, what the data was showing, explained the locked study. Explained James's new interest in my schedule. Explained why he'd been so supportive, so unusually enthusiastic about me opening that separate account. The one he'd suggested so carefully, so reasonably. The one that was supposed to be just for me. The one that would have made everything so much easier for him. I walked out of that bank into October sunlight that felt like stage lighting, artificial and exposing. My phone buzzed. James, asking what time I'd be home. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type a response. Because Patricia's warning had cracked something open, And now I couldn't stop seeing what had been there all along. Couldn't stop remembering all the small moments that suddenly meant something else entirely. But the real truth? The thing that would break me open completely? I wouldn't understand it fully until much later. Until I learned what he'd actually been planning. Until I discovered exactly how long he'd been preparing for the moment my success would finally, completely, become his. The house felt different when I returned that afternoon. Or maybe I felt different inside it. I stood in the foyer, black and white marble checkerboard, original to the house, cold even through my Louboutins, and listened. James was in his study. I could hear the low murmur of his voice through the heavy mahogany door, the one he'd started locking 6 months ago. Privacy for client calls, he'd explained, and I'd nodded because it made sense. Because everything he said always made sense. That was his gift, making things make sense. I climbed the curved staircase, my hand trailing along the banister that had been polished by a century of wealthy hands before mine. Our bedroom took up the entire 3rd floor. Exposed brick, a fireplace I'd had restored, windows overlooking the neighborhood's private gardens. I'd designed it myself after we bought the house. Created something beautiful. Something mine. Except nothing was entirely mine, was it? That's what Patricia had been trying to tell me. I changed out of my meeting clothes into cashmere loungewear, moving through the practiced ritual of wealthy domesticity. Hung my suit in the custom closet James had insisted we install. "You deserve the best," he'd said, and I'd felt grateful, felt seen, felt like maybe I'd finally arrived at the life I was supposed to have. But gratitude, I was beginning to understand, can be a kind of blindfold. My phone lit up on the dresser, a text from my CFO about a manufacturing issue in our New Jersey facility. I handled it in 3 messages, the efficiency of it almost amusing. I could run a $50 million company from my bedroom, could make decisions that affected thousands of lives. But I couldn't quite bring myself to walk downstairs and ask my husband why the bank had patterns on file about his financial behavior. Instead, I did what I'd been doing for weeks without fully admitting it. I looked. Not dramatically. Not like in movies where wives tear through drawers and find obvious evidence. No. I looked the way you look when you're not quite ready to find anything. Carefully. Almost hoping you won't. His laptop sat on the dresser where he'd left it that morning, closed but not locked away. James was always so confident, so certain I wouldn't cross that boundary. And I hadn't. Not until that moment, not until Patricia's words kept echoing. Patterns we see with women who come into significant wealth after marriage. I opened it. His email was still logged in. He trusted me that much, or perhaps he trusted my conditioning, my good wife compliance. The inbox was organized, color-coded, exactly what you'd expect from a corporate attorney. Client names I recognized, meeting confirmations, newsletter subscriptions, and then in a folder labeled Personal at House Projects, something that made my pulse spike, email exchanges with someone named Richard Halloway, a forensic accountant. I clicked on the most recent thread, dated just 2 weeks ago, skimmed words that felt like ice water. Asset tracing, marital property assessment, optimal timing, documentation of separate versus communal wealth. My breath caught. There was an attachment, a PDF marked Preliminary Analysis, Confidential. My finger hovered over it. Some part of me knew that opening it would change everything, would make real whatever this was, would mean I could never unknow what I was about to know. I opened it anyway. The document was 37 pages long. A financial map of our marriage, my company's valuation timeline, the dates of our anniversary, my mother's death, the house purchase, all marked as relevant milestones. And there, highlighted in yellow on page 12, a section titled, Strategic Positioning for Maximum Marital Asset Claim. I felt my legs go weak. Sat down on the edge of our bed. The bed we'd made love in just that morning. The bed where he'd held me after my mother's funeral. The bed where he'd whispered that he was proud of me when Forbes put me on their cover. The document outlined a strategy, a timeline, a plan that had apparently been in motion for at least 18 months, maybe longer. Every supportive gesture, every encouraging word about my separate account, every piece of advice about protecting my assets, all of it mapped out with legal precision. But it wasn't just about money. That's what made my hands shake as I scrolled through page after page. It was about control, about making sure that when the moment came, and there was a specific moment they were waiting for, a trigger point I couldn't quite identify yet, he would have positioned himself perfectly. I heard his footsteps on the stairs. I closed the laptop with trembling fingers, placed it exactly where it had been, and walked to the window. Pressed my forehead against the cold glass, and watched the October wind strip leaves from the trees in the garden below. Red and gold, falling and falling, covering the ground in what looked like wealth, but was really just decay. "Eleanor?" James's voice behind me, warm and concerned. "Darling, I didn't hear you come in. How was the bank meeting?" I turned to face him. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, tall, distinguished, exactly what central casting would send if you ordered a distinguished Boston husband. Silver at his temples now, lines around his eyes that made him look trustworthy. "It was fine," I heard myself say. "Patricia was very thorough." "Good." He smiled, crossed the room, kissed my forehead. His lips were warm. His cologne was familiar. Everything about him was familiar, except now it wasn't. Now he was a stranger wearing my husband's face. "I was thinking we should go to Menton for dinner. Celebrate your success. You've been working so hard." Celebrate. The word tasted like metal. "That sounds lovely," I said, and watched something flicker in his eyes. Relief? Satisfaction? The comfortable certainty that I was still manageable, still the woman who believed everything he told her. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Patricia had seen to that. The bank's data patterns had seen to that. And now this document, this strategic plan for dismantling my wealth, my autonomy, my carefully built empire, had seen to that. The question was, what exactly was James waiting for? What was the trigger point? The optimal moment his forensic accountant kept referencing? And more importantly, how long did I have before he pulled that trigger? I smiled at my husband and suggested we get ready for dinner, and he smiled back, and we moved through our expensive home like dancers in a play neither of us had written, and I wondered how long we'd been performing without me realizing I was on stage. Menton was perfect, of course. James always chose perfectly. We sat at a corner table overlooking Post Office Square, the kind of table that requires reservations months in advance unless your husband knows the owner. Candles flickered between us. My scallops were seared to translucence. The wine, a Chassagne Montrachet he'd selected without consulting me, was precisely the right temperature. Everything was exactly as it should be, which meant everything was wrong. "You seem distant," James said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. His fingers were warm, confident. The same fingers that had typed those emails to the forensic accountant. The same hand that had held mine when we said our vows 14 years ago, when I'd believed I was marrying a partner, not acquiring a strategist. "Just thinking about the New Jersey facility issue," I lied, and watched him accept the lie with visible relief. He liked it when I was absorbed in work. It meant I wasn't paying attention to him. How had I never noticed that before? "You work too hard," he said, the concerned husband. And I wanted to laugh, or scream, or ask him if his forensic accountant had calculated the value of all those nights I'd worked too hard. All those hours that had built the fortune he was so carefully positioning himself to claim. Instead, I sipped my wine and smiled, and felt something inside me begin to calcify. The thing about realizing you've been deceived is that it makes you question everything. Not just the present moment, but the entire past. Every memory becomes suspect. Every tender gesture transforms into potential manipulation. Had he ever loved me? Or had I been a promising investment from the start? I thought about how we met. I was 25, pitching my research to venture capitalists who kept asking if I had a real scientist who could explain the technical details. James had been there representing one of the firms. After my presentation, which they'd rejected, he'd found me in the lobby, told me they were idiots, asked me to dinner. "You're going to change women's health care," he'd said over that first meal. I can see it. I'd fallen in love with being seen, with having someone believe in me when I was still learning to believe in myself. But what if he'd seen something else entirely? What if he'd looked at my patent portfolio, my clinical trial data, my trajectory, and calculated potential returns? What if I'd been a long-term investment strategy wrapped in courtship? The thought made me feel sick. Or maybe it was the scallops, or the wine, or the weight of understanding that I couldn't trust my own memories anymore. "Eleanor." James's voice pulled me back. He was watching me with something in his eyes. Was it concern? Or was it assessment, the way you'd watch an investment that was behaving unpredictably? "Talk to me. What's really going on?" And here was the moment. I could confront him. Could throw Patricia's warning across the table like a grenade. Could ask about Richard Halloway and strategic positioning and optimal timing. But something stopped me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the same ruthlessness that had built my company. The ability to see several moves ahead, to understand that showing your hand too early means losing the game. Maybe it was the memory of Patricia's whispered warning, the way she'd leaned close as I was leaving. Be careful, and document everything. Or maybe it was something simpler. I wasn't ready to blow up my life in a restaurant where the waiters knew our names. "I think I'm just tired," I said finally. "It's been an intense few months." He relaxed. I watched it happen. The subtle softening of his shoulders, the way his grip on his wine glass loosened. He'd bought it. Or he'd chosen to buy it, which might be the same thing. "Why don't we take a vacation?" he suggested, and something about his tone made my attention sharpen. I was thinking, maybe Christmas? We could go to St. Bart's, stay at the Eden Rock, disconnect completely. Disconnect. The word hung there. "That sounds wonderful," I said carefully. "Though I'd need to check with my board. The Q4 numbers." "Delegate," he interrupted gently. "That's what you pay your executive team for. You deserve to enjoy your success, Eleanor. You've earned it." There it was again. That word, earned. As if my success were a thing that needed his permission to enjoy. As if my company, my work, my achievement were somehow subject to his approval. I looked at my husband across the candlelight and wondered when I'd stopped being a person to him and become a portfolio. We finished dinner, declined dessert. James paid with the credit card linked to our joint account, the account he'd suggested we maintain for household expenses, the account that created a paper trail of financial entanglement. I watched him sign the receipt and wondered if his forensic accountant had noted this dinner, this date, this performance of marital normalcy. The drive home was quiet. Boston at night is beautiful in October. The old buildings lit up, the river reflecting city lights, everything gilded and historic and permanent feeling. I'd loved this city from the first moment I arrived for graduate school. Loved its combination of old money and new ideas, tradition and innovation. Now it felt like a beautiful trap. Back at the brownstone, James went to his study. "Just need to review something for tomorrow." And I climbed the stairs alone. Our bedroom felt like a stage set. The fireplace, the exposed brick, the carefully chosen furniture, All of it suddenly seemed like props in a production I hadn't auditioned for. I sat on the edge of our bed and let myself feel it. The anger, the humiliation, the grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. But underneath all of that, something else was building, something colder and sharper. Because here's what James had miscalculated. I'd built a $50 million company from nothing. I'd fought rooms full of men who'd underestimated me. I'd learned to be strategic, patient, ruthless when necessary. And now, he'd given me the one thing every good strategist needs: advance warning. I opened my phone and typed a message to my personal attorney, not the family lawyer James had recommended, but my own counsel, the one who'd handled my company's formation. Need to meet, urgent, personal matter, tomorrow if possible. Then I opened a secure note-taking app and began documenting. The date I'd seen the laptop, the name Richard Halloway, the PDF title, every detail I could remember from that 37-page strategy document. Patricia had told me to document everything. She'd seen this pattern before. But what she hadn't told me, what I was only beginning to understand, was how deep this pattern went, how long James had been planning, and what he was ultimately waiting for, what trigger point would set his carefully constructed strategy in motion. That answer was still hidden somewhere in our house, in his locked study, in emails I hadn't yet found. And I was going to find it. Because whatever James was planning, whatever his endgame was, I needed to see it coming. I needed to know exactly how much danger I was in. The question wasn't whether my marriage was over. Patricia's warning had already answered that. The question was whether I could protect everything I'd built, my company, my autonomy, my future, from the man sleeping in the study downstairs, the man who'd spent years positioning himself to take it all away. Outside my window, leaves continued to fall in the darkness, covering the garden in layers of beautiful decay. My attorney's office was in the financial district, 37th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Margaret Chen had handled my company's legal formation, every contract, every negotiation. She was brilliant, direct, and expensive enough that her hourly rate made venture capitalists wince. She didn't wince at anything I told her. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral in that way lawyers have when the situation is worse than you realize. 3 days. I was gripping my coffee cup so hard my knuckles were white. Since the bank meeting, Margaret made notes on her legal pad. She still used paper, said it couldn't be hacked, and I watched her face for any reaction. Found none. That scared me more than anything. "Walk me through the document again," she said. "Everything you remember." So I did. The asset tracing, the timeline, the phrase that kept haunting me, optimal timing for maximum marital asset claim, and that vacation suggestion, St. Bart's at Christmas, that had felt less like romance and more like strategy. When I finished, Margaret set down her pen and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy if sympathy were a billable hour. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer." My throat went dry. "Okay. Has James ever asked you to sign anything recently? Update your will, maybe? Create a trust structure? Any documents about the business, even casually?" I started to shake my head, then stopped. "Wait," I said slowly. "There was, about 3 months ago, he brought home papers from his firm. Said it was just a standard marital property agreement, updating things now that the company had gone public. He said it would protect both of us, protect the business from any future liability." Margaret's expression didn't change, but I saw her fingers tighten on her pen. "Did you sign it?" "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. He was so casual about it. We were having dinner, and he put it in front of me with dessert. Said it was routine, that his firm required it for their own records since we'd used them for some early company work. I trusted him. Do you have a copy? He said he'd file it with everything else. Said I didn't need to worry about the details. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Eleanor, Margaret said finally, very carefully, I need you to find that document. Tonight, if possible. Because depending on what you signed, we might be looking at a very different situation than I initially thought. What do you mean? She hesitated, then apparently decided I needed the truth. There are ways to structure marital agreements that look protective, but are actually redistributive, especially if one party doesn't fully understand what they're signing, especially if timing is involved. Trigger events that activate certain clauses. The room tilted. Trigger events? Like what? Like a secondary public offering, like opening international markets, like... She paused. Like taking your company into a specific revenue threshold that would change its valuation structure. My blood went cold. Because 3 weeks ago, I'd announced to the board that we were pursuing FDA approval for our second major product. The one that analysts predicted would triple our company's value. The one that would push us past the $100 million mark. The one James had been unusually enthusiastic about, asking detailed questions, offering to introduce me to regulatory attorneys at his firm. Oh my God, I breathed. Margaret was already moving, pulling up something on her computer. When did you announce the FDA pursuit? October 15th. And the St. Bart's vacation? He suggested it 2 days ago, for Christmas week. She typed rapidly, then turned her screen toward me. It showed a calendar with dates highlighted. The FDA typically announces approval decisions on Fridays. If your application follows standard timelines, you're looking at a decision window between December 20th and January 10th. I stared at the screen, understanding flooding through me like poison. He wants me out of the country, I said, during the decision window. Disconnected, Margaret confirmed. That's what you said he emphasized, right? Disconnecting completely? The St. Bart's plan suddenly made horrifying sense. James wasn't planning a romantic vacation. He was planning isolation, getting me somewhere remote, somewhere I'd be off-grid, somewhere I wouldn't be paying attention to business developments or legal filings or whatever he had planned for the moment my company's value exploded. What happens if the FDA approves while I'm gone? I asked, though I already knew. Already felt the trap closing around me. Depends on what you signed, Margaret said. But if there's a clause triggered by a valuation threshold, and if you're unreachable or unable to respond quickly... She didn't finish. Didn't need to. I thought about James's study. The locked door, the careful privacy. What else was in there? What other documents? What other plans? What other pieces of this puzzle was I still missing? I need to see that agreement, Margaret said, and anything else you can find. But Eleanor... She leaned forward, her voice dropping. You need to be very careful. If James realizes you know, if he suspects you're looking, he might accelerate whatever timeline he's working with. You mean he might file for divorce? I mean he might execute whatever that agreement actually authorizes him to do, which could be much worse than divorce. The words hung in the air between us. Much worse than divorce. What did that mean? What had I signed? What had I agreed to over dessert 3 months ago, trusting the man I'd married, believing in the partnership I thought we'd built? I left Margaret's office in a daze. The elevator ride down 37 floors felt like falling. The autumn sun outside was too bright, too normal. People rushed past on the sidewalk carrying coffee, talking on phones, living regular lives where their husbands weren't secretly dismantling their futures. My phone buzzed. James. Home early tonight? Thought we could finalize the St. Bart's booking. I stared at the message, at the casual tone, the manufactured intimacy, the careful herding toward his timeline, his plan, his endgame. And something inside me, The part that had fought every obstacle to build my company. The part that had refused to accept no from investors and regulators and an entire industry that wanted to dismiss me. That part crystallized into something hard and clear. I typed back. Sounds perfect. Can't wait. Then I called my assistant. Clear my schedule for tonight. Family emergency. Because I was going home early, but not for the reason James thought. I was going home to break into my husband's study, to find that marital agreement, to understand exactly what trap I'd walked into. And I was going to do it today, this afternoon, while James was still at his office, before he had any idea that his carefully constructed strategy was about to meet the woman who'd built a $50 million company by refusing to be underestimated. The train ride back to Beacon Hill felt like preparing for battle. The autumn trees blurred past the windows, red, gold, orange, all those beautiful colors that meant things were dying. But they also meant things were transforming, preparing for something new. I thought about Patricia's whispered warning, about Margaret's careful fear, about all the patterns, all the women who'd sat in bank offices and law firms and heard these same warnings too late. But I wasn't too late. Not yet. James had given me advance notice by being just a little too confident, a little too certain I wouldn't look, wouldn't question, wouldn't fight back. He'd miscalculated. And that miscalculation was going to cost him everything. The question was, what was I going to find in that study? What truth was waiting behind that locked mahogany door? And more terrifying, once I found it, once I understood the full scope of what James had planned, would I be strong enough to do what needed to be done? The train pulled into my station. I stood, gathered my bag, and walked out into the October afternoon like a woman going to war in cashmere and Louboutin. My marriage was over. I'd known that since Patricia's warning. But my future, that was still mine to fight for. The brownstone was silent when I let myself in. Empty in that particular way that feels both relieving and ominous. I was alone, but I was also completely alone with what I was about to do. I stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway. Each second felt weighted, consequential. Because once I crossed this line, once I broke into James's study, I couldn't uncross it. Couldn't pretend I still trusted him. Couldn't maintain the fiction of our marriage for even one more day. But then, the fiction had been broken 3 days ago in Patricia's office. I just hadn't been ready to admit it yet. I climbed the stairs to the second floor where James's study occupied what had once been a drawing room. The door was solid mahogany, original to the house, with a modern lock he'd installed himself. "Just want to make sure client files are secure," he'd said. And I'd nodded because it made sense. Everything always made sense until it didn't. I tried the handle first, knowing it would be locked, but needing to feel that resistance, that physical confirmation of his secrecy. It didn't budge. Of course it didn't. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the cold brass, and felt something break open inside me. Not anger anymore. Something deeper. Grief, maybe. For the woman I'd been 3 days ago. For the marriage I'd believed in. For the version of James I'd loved. The one who might never have existed at all. When my mother died 2 years ago, James had held me while I cried. Had arranged the funeral, handled the estate logistics, been exactly what I needed. I'd been so grateful, so relieved to have a partner who could be strong when I couldn't. But now I wondered, had he been calculating even then? Had he seen my vulnerability and cataloged it, stored it away as useful information? Had my grief been an opportunity to demonstrate his indispensability? The thought made me feel sick. I went to our bedroom, to James's dresser. He kept a small wooden box in the top drawer, cufflinks, his father's watch, a few other personal items, and keys. I'd seen them before, never thought twice about them. My hands shook as I opened the drawer. The box was there, unlocked. Because James never imagined I'd look, never imagined I'd cross this boundary. Inside, among the cufflinks and collar stays, were 3 small keys on a leather fob. One of them had to fit his study. I took the fob, closed the drawer carefully, and walked back to the mahogany door. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it, could feel it in my throat, behind my eyes. This was it. The moment of absolute violation, of his privacy, of our marriage, of every promise we'd made to trust each other. Except he'd violated those promises first, hadn't he? He'd violated them months ago, maybe years ago, maybe from the very beginning. The second key fit. The lock turned with a soft click that sounded like an ending. I pushed the door open and stepped into my husband's secret world. The study was immaculate. A mahogany desk faced the window overlooking our garden. Built-in bookshelves lined 2 walls, law books mostly, some fiction, everything organized by height and color in that obsessive way James had. A leather chair, a Persian rug, everything masculine and elegant and expensive. And on the desk, a closed laptop and a stack of file folders. I moved toward the desk, my footsteps silent on the rug. Outside the window, I could see the garden where leaves continued their slow fall, where James and I had planted roses together our first spring in this house. I'd been so happy that day, so certain we were building something permanent. The top folder was labeled Eden Rock Reservation. I opened it. Inside were confirmation emails for the St. Bart's vacation. But not just any reservation. He'd booked the Villa Rockstar, the most expensive, most remote accommodation on the property. The one with limited cell service, limited internet. The one that prided itself on offering complete digital detox, complete disconnection. My hands were shaking as I set it aside and reached for the next folder. This one was labeled simply EA in James's precise handwriting. My initials. I opened it and felt the world tilt sideways. Inside were documents I'd never seen. Copies of contracts I didn't remember signing. Financial projections for my company that could only have come from internal sources, from people on my own team. And there, paper clipped to the front, was the marital agreement Margaret had asked about. I pulled it out and started reading. The language was dense, legal, designed to be skimmed rather than studied. But Margaret had trained me well over the years. I knew how to read contracts now, knew how to find the clauses that mattered. And there it was, on page 7, in a section titled Valuation-Based Asset Distribution. In the event that Spouse A's primary business entity, Ashford Biosciences, Inc., achieves a valuation threshold of $100,000 or greater, and subject to the triggering events outlined in Section 12.3, the marital property structure shall automatically convert to... I had to read it 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a divorce strategy. It was something much more elegant, much more devastating. If my company hit that $100 million threshold, which the FDA approval would guarantee, and if certain conditions were met, James wouldn't just get half of my assets in a divorce. He would automatically acquire a controlling interest in the business itself. Not through court proceedings, not through negotiation. Automatically, immediately, through a structure I'd apparently agreed to. I'd signed over my company to my husband, contingent on my own success. The paper slipped from my fingers, drifted to the floor like those autumn leaves, like everything dying and falling around me. I sank into James's desk chair and let myself feel the full weight of it. The betrayal, the manipulation, the years of careful positioning, of supportive gestures that were really just moves in a long game I hadn't known we were playing. He'd married me when I was nobody. When I was a graduate student with ideas and ambition, but no money, no power, no value by his world standards. And he'd seen potential, not in me, in what I could build, in what I could become. I was never a wife, I was an investment strategy with a wedding ring. The clock downstairs chimed 4. James would be home by 6. I had 2 hours. I took photos of everything. Every page of the marital agreement. Every document in that folder. The financial projections that showed someone on my team was feeding him information. The timeline that mapped out his strategy with clinical precision. And then I found the other folders. The ones that made everything even worse. One was labeled backup measures. Inside were contact details for journalists, investors, board members, outlines of stories he could leak if I resisted, scandals he could manufacture. My personal medical history, how did he get that? With notes about which details could be contextualized to suggest instability. He hadn't just planned to take my company. He'd planned to destroy me if I fought back. Another folder contained correspondence with Richard Halloway, the forensic accountant. But these weren't just financial analyses. They were profiles, psychological assessments, studies of my behavior patterns, my vulnerabilities, my fears. There was a section about my mother's death, how grief had made me more compliant, how I'd responded well to strong guidance during emotional distress. He'd weaponized my pain, had studied it like data, had used my darkest moments to make me easier to control. I sat there surrounded by evidence of my husband's careful dismantling of my life, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Utterly, completely vulnerable. Because here was the truth Patricia hadn't told me, that Margaret was only beginning to understand, that I hadn't wanted to face. I'd been so focused on being strong, on building my company, on proving I could succeed in a world designed to dismiss women like me, that I'd never protected myself at home. I'd never imagined I needed to. I'd thought marriage was a sanctuary. But I'd married a predator, a sophisticated, charming, patient predator who'd spent 14 years positioning himself to consume everything I'd built. And the worst part? I'd helped him. Every time I'd trusted his advice, signed his documents, believed in his support, I'd been funding my own destruction. My phone buzzed. James again. Leaving office now. Should be home by 6:15. Looking forward to tonight. Looking forward to finalizing the St. Bart's booking. To getting me isolated and disconnected during the critical window. To executing whatever final steps his plan required. I looked around his study, at the evidence of his betrayal, at the careful architecture of my dismantling, and I felt something shift inside me. Yes, I was vulnerable. Yes, I'd been deceived. Yes, I'd made mistakes by trusting someone I shouldn't have trusted. But I wasn't the woman I'd been 3 days ago. I wasn't even the woman I'd been 2 hours ago. Patricia had warned me. Margaret had armed me with knowledge, and James had made one critical error. He'd given me time, just enough advance warning, and I was going to use every second of it. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, locked the study door, returned the keys to his dresser. Then I went to our bedroom and called Margaret. "I found it," I said when she answered. "All of it, and it's worse than we thought." "Send me the photos," she said immediately. "Every single page. And Eleanor, yes? Don't confront him. Not yet. We need to move fast, but we need to move smart." I looked at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. I looked the same as I had this morning. Same cashmere, same carefully applied makeup, same wealthy woman in her beautiful home. But everything underneath had changed. "What do I do?" I asked. "You pretend," Margaret said. "Just for a little while longer. You smile, you make dinner plans, you discuss St. Bart's. And tomorrow morning, you meet me downtown. Because we're going to dismantle his strategy before he even knows we found it." I hung up and heard the front door open downstairs. James was home early. "Eleanor?" His voice drifted up the stairs, warm and familiar. "Darling, where are you?" I took a breath. checked my reflection one more time, and prepared to give the performance of my life. "Coming," I called down, my voice steady and sweet. And I walked down to greet my husband, knowing exactly what he was, knowing exactly what he'd planned, and knowing that everything was about to change. The next 72 hours were the strangest of my life. I smiled at James over breakfast, discussed St. Bart's amenities, pretended to be excited about disconnecting completely. All while Margaret and her team worked behind the scenes, dismantling his strategy piece by piece. "You're glowing," James said over coffee on Saturday morning, and I realized with a dark sort of amusement that I probably was. There's a particular energy that comes from knowing exactly what you're up against, from moving from victim to strategist. "I'm just happy," I told him, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was happy to finally see clearly, happy to be fighting back, happy to be reclaiming the power I'd unknowingly surrendered. He kissed my forehead, satisfied, certain, still so certain he'd won. Margaret worked fast. By Monday, we'd filed emergency motions to freeze the marital agreement pending investigation of fraud and coercion. By Tuesday, we'd identified the source of James's internal information, my former CFO's assistant, who'd been sleeping with one of James's law partners. By Wednesday, we had restraining orders in place preventing James from accessing or disposing of any marital assets. But we didn't tell him. Not yet. Margaret's strategy was more elegant than that. "Let him think he's won," she said during one of our midnight strategy sessions. "Let him think you're compliant, manageable, exactly what he expects. And when he makes his move, we'll be ready." So I played the role. The supportive wife, the grateful millionaire still learning to enjoy her success, the woman who needed her husband's guidance. I was brilliant at it. Years of pitching to dismissive investors had taught me how to perform femininity that made men comfortable, how to seem just capable enough to be interesting, just uncertain enough to need saving. I'd hated using those skills, had vowed never to diminish myself again once I had my own money, my own power. But for this, for dismantling James's carefully constructed trap, I'd perform whatever role necessary. The FDA announcement came on Friday, December 20th, exactly within Margaret's predicted window. I was in my office when my head of regulatory affairs burst in, tears streaming down her face. "We got it," she sobbed. Full approval. "Eleanor, we got it." My company's value would triple by market. Open Monday. Everything James had been positioning for, everything his strategy required, had just activated. I called him immediately, let my voice shake with excitement. "James, it happened. The FDA, they approved it. Everything we've been working toward. Eleanor, that's incredible." His voice was warm, proud, perfect. "I knew they would. I'm so proud of you. We should celebrate. Where are you?" "At the office. I came in early. I couldn't sleep." "Stay there. I'm coming to you. We'll have champagne, He paused. "Actually, you know what? Let's go home. Celebrate properly. Just the two of us." There it was. The urgency underneath the warmth. He needed me home. Needed me where he could control the environment, could execute whatever next steps his plan required. "That sounds perfect," I said, and meant it. Because Margaret and her team were already at my house, along with a forensic accountant, a notary, and a process server. The trap was set. I drove home slowly, deliberately, gave James time to arrive first, to settle in, to feel comfortable and in control. The December afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of weather that makes Boston look like a Christmas card. Beacon Hill was decorated for the holidays, wreaths on doors, lights in windows, everything festive and beautiful. My hands were steady on the wheel. My heart was steady too. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, 3 weeks transforming from victim to strategist. I'd learned something important during those weeks. Money doesn't change who you are. It reveals who you've always been. And apparently, I'd always been someone who fights back. When I pulled up to the brownstone, I could see lights on inside. James would be in his study, probably, making calls, setting things in motion, thinking he'd won. I let myself in quietly. The house smelled like pine. James had put up a Christmas tree in the front parlor, another performance of normalcy. I could hear voices upstairs, male voices, more than one. My pulse quickened, but I didn't panic. Margaret had prepared me for every possibility. I climbed the stairs, each step deliberate. At the top, I could see James's study door was open. He stood inside with 2 men I didn't recognize. His attorney, probably, and someone else. They were looking at documents spread across his desk. James looked up as I appeared in the doorway. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise? Concern? Then it was gone, replaced by his usual warm smile. "Darling," he said. "There you are." These are colleagues from the firm. We're handling something routine. Why don't you go change? And No, I said quietly. The word hung in the air. James's smile faltered. "Eleanor?" I said no. I stepped into the study, and as I did, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs behind me, followed by her team. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to celebrate. And I'm certainly not going to St. Bart's. I watched understanding dawn on James's face, watched him realize, finally, that I knew, that I'd known, that he'd miscalculated catastrophically. "What is this?" he asked, but his voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What remained was cold, assessing. The real James, finally visible. "This," Margaret said, stepping forward, "is a fraud investigation. Mr. Ashford, you're being served with notice that your marital agreement with Mrs. Ashford has been deemed invalid due to misrepresentation and coercion. Additionally, we're filing charges of corporate espionage, theft of proprietary information, and conspiracy to commit fraud." One of the men with James, his attorney presumably, started to protest, but Margaret cut him off with a gesture. "We have documentation of everything," she continued. "The forensic analysis, the internal information theft, the psychological manipulation, the attempt to isolate Mrs. Ashford during a critical business period. All of it." She handed James a folder, not unlike the one I'd found in his desk. "You're also being served with divorce papers. Mrs. Ashford is petitioning for full dissolution of the marriage with cause. She's requesting a restraining order preventing you from approaching her or any of her business interests. And she's pursuing criminal charges for the theft of trade secrets." James looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in 14 years, I saw him see me clearly. Not as an investment, not as a manageable asset, but as an opponent, as someone who'd outmaneuvered him. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was different now, harder. "You don't understand what you're doing. That agreement is legally binding. My attorneys have confirmed. Your attorneys confirmed what you paid them to confirm." I interrupted. "But fraud vitiates everything, James. You should know that. You're a lawyer." I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the calculation in his eyes. He was already strategizing, already thinking about backup plans, about the scandal folder I'd photographed, about ways to hurt me. But I was ready for that too. "If you're thinking about the journalist contacts," I said softly, "the ones you were going to use to manufacture scandals, they've already been contacted by my team. They know about your strategy. Some of them are quite interested in a different story now, about a corporate attorney who married a graduate student and spent 14 years positioning himself to steal her company." His jaw tightened. "You can't prove." I can prove all of it. I have photos of every document in your study, every email to Richard Halloway, every projection, every timeline, every psychological profile you had him create of me." I paused, including the one where you noted how my mother's death made me more compliant. Something flickered in his eyes then. Maybe shame, maybe just anger at being caught. "You broke into my study," he said. "You broke into my life," I replied, "into my company, my finances, my future. You weaponized my trust, my grief, my love. You married me as a business strategy." "That's not..." He stopped, looked at Margaret, at her team, at his own attorneys who were already backing toward the door. "Eleanor, we can discuss this privately. Work something out. You don't want the publicity of a trial, the exposure." "Actually," I said, "I do. Because the story isn't going to be about me. It's going to be about the pattern, about how many other women this has happened to, how many other wives have been treated as investments, as assets to be acquired and liquidated." I thought of Patricia, leaning across that desk, whispering her warning. I thought of Margaret saying there were patterns, that the bank saw this happen again and again. "I'm not going to be quiet about this," I continued. "I'm not going to settle privately to protect your reputation. I'm going to make sure every woman who comes after me knows what to watch for, knows the warning signs, knows how to protect herself." James stared at me, and I could see him finally understanding. Not just that he'd lost, but that he'd fundamentally misunderstood who I was. He'd thought my success had made me vulnerable, had given him leverage. But my success had given me something else entirely. The resources to fight back. The platform to be heard. The power to protect not just myself, but others. "You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings," Margaret said. "After that, you're not permitted to return to this property. Your assets are frozen pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. And Mr. Ashford..." She smiled, and it was sharp as a knife. "Don't even think about leaving the country. We've already alerted the relevant authorities." James looked at me one last time. I don't know what he saw. Maybe the woman he'd married. Maybe the woman he'd created through years of careful manipulation. Maybe the woman I'd become in spite of him. "I loved you," he said. And it might have even been true in whatever way he was capable of love. "No," I replied gently. "You loved what I could become, what you could take from me. That's not the same thing." He left. His attorneys scurried after him. Margaret's team began documenting everything in the study, photographing, cataloging, building the case that would dismantle him as thoroughly as he'd planned to dismantle me. I stood in that study, his sanctuary, his planning room, his headquarters for my destruction, and felt something settle inside me. Not happiness exactly, not victory in any celebratory sense, but certainty, clarity, the clean, clear feeling of knowing exactly who I was and what I was capable of. I'd come so close to losing everything. If Patricia hadn't warned me, if I hadn't looked at that laptop, if I'd gone to St. Bart's as planned. But I had looked. I had fought back, and I'd won. The question now was, what came next? What did life look like on the other side of this? Who was I without the marriage I'd built my adult life around, even if that marriage had been a lie? The answer to that was still waiting, still unfolding, still revealing itself in ways I was only beginning to understand. But I was ready for it, ready for whatever truth came next. After I became a millionaire, the bank manager whispered something only women get warned about. She told me to watch for patterns, for sudden changes in behavior, for support that felt just a little too controlling, advice that came with invisible strings, love that operated like a long-term investment strategy. But what Patricia actually told me, what I've never shared until now, what I couldn't fully understand until everything unfolded, was this. Eleanor, I've seen your husband's accounts, not just the joint ones, his personal accounts. And there's a pattern we see sometimes with men who marry women on the verge of success. They start preparing 18 to 24 months before the wealth actually materializes. They build infrastructure. They create paper trails. They position themselves so that when the moment comes, they can execute quickly. She'd paused then, her voice dropping even lower. But the most dangerous ones, the truly sophisticated ones, they don't just position themselves to take half. They position themselves to take everything. And they do it in ways that look like love until the very last moment. That's what she'd been trying to tell me. That's what the data showed. That's what I couldn't hear fully until I saw that document in James's study. He hadn't married me planning to divorce me someday and take half my assets. That would have been cruel but comprehensible. No, he'd married me planning to become me, to absorb my company, my work, my entire identity into his portfolio, to transform me from person to asset, from wife to acquisition. And the most chilling part, it almost worked. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. The fraud investigation took longer. James fought every step, tried every legal maneuver, attempted to manufacture scandals just as I'd known he would. But Margaret was relentless, and the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, he settled. Walked away with nothing from my company, a small portion of the house value, and his reputation in tatters. 3 major newspapers covered the case. 2 of them used the phrase financial predator in their headlines. I testified before a state legislative committee about the legal loopholes that had allowed James's strategy to nearly succeed. Helped draft new requirements for marital financial agreements, new protections for entrepreneurs entering marriage with significant intellectual property. Patricia called me after the first article ran. "You did it," she said simply. "You warned everyone else." But the real transformation, the one that mattered most, wasn't about James or the divorce, or even the legal reforms. It was about what I discovered in the silence after he left. I remember the first morning I woke up alone in that brownstone, truly alone, knowing James wasn't coming back. It was January, cold and gray, the kind of Boston winter morning that makes you want to stay in bed forever. I got up anyway, made coffee in the quiet kitchen, stood at the window overlooking the garden where all those leaves had fallen, where everything had looked like decay. But underneath the snow now I knew spring was already preparing. Bulbs were dormant but alive. Roots were gathering strength. Everything that looked dead was really just transforming. I realized something then. I'd spent my entire adult life being afraid of being alone, afraid that success without partnership meant I'd failed somehow at being a woman, that wealth without a husband to share it with was incomplete, insufficient, shameful even. That fear had made me vulnerable to James, had made me grateful for his presence, willing to overlook small warning signs, eager to believe his support was genuine. But sitting in that kitchen, watching snow fall over my garden, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, completely, utterly content with my own company. I didn't need someone to validate my success, didn't need a partner to make my wealth meaningful, didn't need a husband to prove I was worthy of love. I was enough, had always been enough. My company, my work, my achievement, they were mine, and they were complete exactly as they were. The FDA approval had triggered the valuation increase James had been waiting for. My company was now worth $140 million. I owned 98% of it, had bought back the small shares James's fraudulent agreement had attempted to claim. I could do anything, go anywhere, build anything. And for the first time in my life, those possibilities felt like freedom rather than pressure. I hired a new CFO, promoted 3 women into senior leadership, started a foundation to fund women entrepreneurs in healthcare, created a legal assistance program for women navigating divorce from financial predators. And I did it all alone. Not because I was against partnership, but because I finally understood the difference between partnership and predation, between support and control, between love and strategy. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was back at that bank. Different meeting, different context. Patricia walked me through some foundation paperwork, and as we finished, she said, "You look different." "Different how?" "At peace," she said simply. "When you first came here, you carried your success like it didn't quite fit, like you were waiting for someone to tell you it was okay to have it. Now you wear it like it was always yours." She was right. I did feel different. Not because I'd defeated James, though I had. Not because I'd protected my company, though I'd done that too. But because I'd finally, completely understood what Patricia had been trying to tell me that first day. The warning wasn't just about James. It was about all the ways women are taught to make themselves smaller, safer, more manageable, to treat their own success as something that needs protecting from themselves, to believe that achievement without male approval is somehow incomplete. The bank manager hadn't just whispered about financial patterns. She'd whispered about something much more fundamental. The pattern of women who build empires, and then hand the keys to men who claim to love them. I stood in that bank office, looking out over the city I'd claimed as my own, and thought about all the women who'd sat in similar offices, received similar warnings, faced similar betrayals. And I thought about all the women who would come after me, the ones who would hear these stories, recognize these patterns, protect themselves earlier and more fiercely. That's why I'm telling this story now. Why I'm willing to share the intimate details of my humiliation, my near destruction, my fight back. Because after I became a millionaire, I learned the most valuable lesson of all. Your success doesn't need anyone's permission. Your wealth doesn't need anyone's validation. Your power doesn't need anyone's approval. And the moment you truly understand that, the moment you stop looking for someone to make your achievement mean something, that's when you become truly dangerous, truly free, truly yourself. I live alone in my brownstone now. The garden has recovered from winter, roses blooming again, everything green and alive. I have dinner parties sometimes, fill the house with friends and laughter and people who celebrate rather than calculate. I date occasionally, carefully, with clear eyes and firm boundaries and absolutely no interest in making someone else's comfort more important than my own clarity. My company continues to grow. We're developing a third product now, one that will help millions of women. I make decisions without checking with anyone, sign contracts without seeking validation, build my empire exactly the way I envision it. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Patricia, about her whispered warning that saved my life, about all the bank managers and lawyers and accountants who see these patterns, who try to warn us, who operate in the small spaces between professional obligation and human compassion. I think about how we save each other, how women pass these warnings down like inheritance, like heirlooms, like the most valuable currency of all, knowledge that could protect someone else. That's what wealth really bought me, not the brownstone or the art or the expensive clothes. It bought me the platform to warn others, the resources to fight back, the power to transform my near destruction into protection for women who come after me. After I became a millionaire, the bank manager whispered something only women get warned about, that success makes you valuable, and valuable things attract predators. But here's what she didn't tell me, what I had to learn myself. Success also makes you powerful. And power, when you finally claim it completely, makes you dangerous to anyone who tries to take what's yours. I'm dangerous now. Not with anger, with clarity. Not with vengeance, with boundaries. Not with bitterness, with the absolute certainty that I will never again mistake control for love, strategy for partnership, or manipulation for support. And if you're listening to this, if something in this story resonates with a warning you've been ignoring, a pattern you've been explaining away, a support that feels just a little too controlling, listen to that instinct. Trust that whisper. Protect what you've built. Because after you become a millionaire, or after you achieve anything significant, anything someone else might want to claim, that's when you need to be most vigilant, most fierce, most willing to fight for what's yours. That's the truth Patricia tried to tell me. That's the warning I'm passing on to you. Your success is yours. Your achievement is yours. Your power is yours. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. The snow has melted in my garden now. Spring came, as it always does. And I'm still here, still building, still growing. But this time, entirely on my own terms. That's the ending no one promises you. That's the truth beyond the warning. Freedom doesn't come from having wealth. It comes from understanding that you were always enough to protect it. If this story touched you, leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe for the next journey. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And somewhere, another woman needs to hear that she's not alone,